the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, the DeYoung Museum, and the Legion of Honor. I'm delighted to welcome you to our annual McCoy Jones Lecture, which is a very special treat today. We have with us Talia Spielholz, who is Assistant Curator of Costume and Textile Arts with the museums. She joined our team 3 years ago as Curatorial Projects Coordinator, where she supported key departmental operations and contributed to exhibitions and publications before assuming her current role. Her work spans curatorial research, exhibition preparation, and writing, with an interest in exploring the intersections between fashion and textiles, gender, and cultural narratives. Her writings have been featured in the publications Fashioning San Francisco, A Century of Style, and Jules Francois Crahe, Rediscovering a Grand Couturier. Prior to joining our museums, Ms. Spielholz held administrative, curatorial, and bench jeweler roles at the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and Artemer Studio in Tel Aviv, Israel. She holds a Master of Arts in Costume Studies from New York University and a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Jewelry and Metalsmithing from the Rhode Island School of Design. Her talk today is the culmination of 3 years of research on the formation of the McCoy Jones Collection of Central Asian and Middle Eastern rugs and carpets, a selection of which are on view upstairs on the second floor of this building. If you have time after this talk, I encourage you to go upstairs and take a look. And please be sure also to pick up a copy of this month's Holly magazine, in which Ms. Spielholz has authored an article on this topic. Without further ado, please welcome her to the stage.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Laura, for the introduction and for asking me to be this year's McCoy Jones speaker. As she said, I've been researching this topic for around 3 years since I started, so I'm really happy that this can coincide with the exhibition that we have up right now. Before I begin, I'd like to thank a few more people. The Textiles Conservation team here at the museums, Beth Suhe, Ann Getz, and Lara Garcia-Vidren, our departmental cataloging fellow, Sophia Kane, all of the technicians who at one point or another supported this project, Julia Pike, exhibitions designer, Becky Burton, museum registrar, Randy Dodson, head photographer, Britta Traub, rights and assets manager, and our museum archivist, Lisa Monhoff, who facilitated my research of the museum's largely unprocessed archival files. In the spring of 1980, it was announced that H. McCoy Jones, a businessman and prominent rug collector, would donate his extensive collection of carpets, rugs, and textiles from across Central Asia, West Asia, the Middle East, the Caucasus, and Anatolia to the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. McCoy, who at the time lived in Maryland, had been collecting this material for over 60 years and agreed to bequeath over 630 rugs and embroideries from these regions to the museums. In total, the McCoy Jones Collection consists of over 1,000 objects from across the globe, just within the Costume and Textiles department alone. While there are multiple significant parts of this full gift, my presentation today focuses mainly on the initial bequest of those 130-ish works. Born in Stillwater, New York on October 19, 1896, McCoy graduated from the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1918 or 19. In 1922, while serving as a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy in Constantinople, he bought his first carpet from a market stall in present-day Ukraine. McCoy initially became interested in rugs while serving as an assistant to Admiral Mark L. Bristol, commander of the American occupation of the Bosphorus. According to McCoy, he would look after Americans and Europeans coming over from Washington, D.C., to look for oil concessions in the region. The Navy was worried about spies, so he took them sightseeing during the day and would report on the previous night's activities at breakfast with the Admiral every morning at 8 a.m. Foreigners always wanted to visit the Grand Bazaar and the other marketplaces in Constantinople. As a hub of trade, rugs from around the East came through Constantinople, so dealers and buyers could find anything they were looking for from any area. It was on these trips out and about in Constantinople and in other areas that McCoy first started learning about rugs. He did not know anything about them and at first had no interest either. but he had to tour these foreigners around and had to partake in conversations about rugs. After getting to know some of the vendors and European buyers, McCoy finally made his first purchase in 1922 and instantly caught the collecting bug. A biography of McCoy in Holly magazine in January 1985, written by president of the Haji Baba Society, Jeff Boucher, noted that McCoy had purchased his first rug, a Teke main carpet, from a stall in Odessa in 1922. I was able to figure out which carpet in the museum's collection was in fact McCoy's first purchase after finding his original catalog card box tucked away in the Textiles library upstairs last year. In addition to books and other volumes, we have additional ephemera that we use for research, and I think that this catalog box may have come in as a non-accessioned type of support material along with his collection. McCoy organized his collection using these cards and also used them for some concise notes about provenance or why he chose to purchase each work in his personal collection. Because he kept thorough notes and because his own numbering system had been recorded in our records, I was able to identify this carpet, which McCoy denoted as a Teke rug of wool, as the one that he had purchased in 1922, which he said at the time, and is written on the card, quote, the busiest in the world for the export of rugs to the United States and Europe. After resigning from the Navy in the late 1920s, McCoy studied business administration at New York University and worked in private investment while remaining as an officer in the Naval Reserves. McCoy grew his collection throughout his life, purchasing rugs, carpets, and textiles primarily from across Central Asia, Iran, the Caucasus, Turkey, and West China. He developed a discerning eye for quality, which he honed the more he saw, traveled, and collected. McCoy sought to use his expanding collection to demonstrate the breadth of what was made by different tribes living across these different areas. As an astute businessman, he would also often buy works and then sell them at a profit when better examples came along. Throughout his 6 decades of collecting, McCoy became well known amongst other collectors for the depths of his accumulated knowledge on the textiles and carpets themselves and on how to best collect, as well as for his intense passion. While he collected widely, McCoy was most drawn to and interested in pile rugs and carpets woven by different nomadic Turkmen tribes living across Central Asia. Turkmen are a Turkic-speaking ethnic group native to Central Asia, and while a majority of the 8 million members live in Turkmenistan, there are also groups that inhabit parts of Iran, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan. There are several different Turkmen tribal subgroups, and while much of their visual language and weaving traditions overlap and share aesthetics with each other and with other groups along the trade routes of the Silk Road, Turkmen rugs are distinguishable because of their goals or the intricate medallions that are woven into many of their rug designs. Teke goals, which are the medallions that you saw on the carpet on the previous slide, are widely considered by scholars to be the most consistent across time and geography. When McCoy met and married Caroline Jones, a British nurse midwife in the 1950s, she became his partner in life and in collecting. McCoy and Caroline lived for the first part of their marriage in Washington, D.C., in a house close to the original location of the Textile Museum in the Kalorama neighborhood of the city. According to stories from friends and from McCoy and Caroline themselves, they had what they called a, quote, ruggery on the 3rd floor of their house. This was where they stored the rugs in their collection that were not on view or used in the living areas of their home. It was in the ruggery that they would also host show and tells of the collection, in which they would invite friends and other rug collectors to look at and discuss rugs in their own collections. The ruggery was organized by tribe and could seat 80 people for a lecture or a show and tell. They also lived with 2 Airedale Terriers who they claimed guarded the collection and could sniff out synthetic dyes. Throughout most of their marriage, McCoy and Caroline lived between England and Maryland, eventually moving into a home in Reno, Nevada in the early 1980s. Caroline, née Murray Brown, was younger than McCoy. Her father was killed in England during a blitz when she was young, and after her mother died in 1953, she moved to the United States for a year, where she lived with friends who worked at the British Embassy in the city, in Washington, D.C. She was invited to all of the embassy parties, and that's where she met McCoy. in a party that they both attended in 1954. In his eulogy for McCoy, Hans Koenig, a close friend and fellow rug collector, said, quote, "During this period of courtship, which he observed during visits to England while McCoy and Caroline were living there, McCoy seemed to grow younger. He was a mixture of bashfulness and pride, courtesy and affection, which to us who were much younger was very touching. And the lady, Caroline was her name, responded in kind. She gave him affection and security, joined him in his hobbies, and tolerated his whims," end quote. Koenig also stated that while McCoy was officially a rug collector, he also liked to hold on to things more generally, that he, quote, "was like a squirrel keeping everything because you never know when you might need something," end quote. On collecting as a phenomenon and on collectors, McCoy said, quote, "You want to remember that a collector is a peculiar animal. He's got an incurable disease, and that is to collect, and he never loses that." After McCoy started collecting rugs, objects that he previously knew nothing about and had never really experienced as art objects, became a lifelong obsession. McCoy and Caroline became some of the most well-known rug collectors in the United States and worked hard to foster a global network of like-minded collectors. A member of the New York Haji Baba Club, McCoy Jones was instrumental in establishing the Washington, D.C. Haji Babas in the fall of 1964. The New York-based Haji Baba Club was established in 1932 by collectors of Eastern rugs and carpets who were looking for camaraderie amongst other collectors and aficionados. Many of them decorated their homes using their collected treasures, but were also interested in cataloging and studying them for their artistic and historical value. They went to museums and visited private collections across the East Coast together and would then meet to discuss their thoughts, often at a restaurant or at a member's home. It was typical for members to bring new acquisitions to their own collections to these meetings and discuss them with the group. In his History of the Haji Baba Club, 1932 to 1960, Haji Olive Olmsted Foster noted that the spirit, quote, "the spirit of the club was that of cooperation rather than competition. And as members were building up their own personal rug collections, agreement was reached among them on means of avoiding the possibility that one Haji might be bidding against another on a rug that was available at auction." In October 1959, about 30 club members went to the Textile Museum, founded by George Hewitt Myers in Washington, D.C., for a visit. In anticipation of their visit, staff unrolled carpets that were in storage and used the opportunity to look over what was not on display. That same evening, club members went to the home of Mr. and Mrs. H. McCoy Jones, non-resident members of the New York Haji Baba Club. Later, members of the club were invited by the Textile Museum to show works from their own collections as part of an exhibition meant to support the Textile Museum's goals and highlight the different types of carpets and rugs that members owned. The works needn't be of the best quality or the most expensive an individual collector owned. Foster noted in his History of the Club that this 1960 exhibit was as popular with local textile museum goers as other shows produced by the institution. In the fall of 1963, the Washington Rug Society, later named the International Haji Baba Society, was established with McCoy as its first president. In the fall of 1964. The club would follow the organization of the New York Club. The society functioned similarly to the New York Haji Baba Club, but was organized within the Textile Museum of Washington, D.C.'s membership. These sort of clubs hosted lectures from collectors, as well as discussions and forums where people could be invited to show and tell. Many of these discussions also happened in people's homes. Before the founding of the D.C. Club, George Hewitt Myers often hosted scholars and other Hajis in his home. Rug societies like the New York and Washington, D.C. clubs were instrumental in fostering community around an appreciation for rug and carpet collecting. They also functioned as a way to open up a type of collecting that had been limited to the ultra-wealthy through open discussion of any and all rugs, no matter the price. While collectors revered the objects for their artistry and material use and understood the technical complexity of their weaving, they were still viewed and understood largely as objects of an esoteric other, and much of what collectors knew about the works in their collection, at least when they were first starting out, came from their own interpretive lenses, mostly colored by their own aesthetic preferences. The rug appreciation clubs that formed around Europe and the US in the 20th century took their names from an 1824 novel called The Adventures of Haji Baba of Isfahan. The book was written by James Justinian Morer, who was a former British envoy to Iran from 1808 to 1809 and again from 1810 to 1814, during a period of diplomatic tension with Europe. He wrote a sequel, Haji Baba of Isfahan, in England in 1828. Based on his experience living in Iran, both books were satirical, orientalizing tales of the 19th century European explorer in the Orient. McCoy, as well as his contemporaries and the collectors that preceded him, saw themselves as modern Hajis, exploring the unknown world of the East and uncovering treasures. McCoy, for his part in the Washington Haji Babas and the overall community of rug and carpet collectors on the East Coast, was well known as a friendly and knowledgeable collector who was always keen to talk about rugs. He was also, throughout his years as a collector, passionate about creating centers of carpet and rug study in each place that he lived. McCoy started the Washington Haji Babas in part because he found the New York Club too complacent and too insular. He found that many of its members and the collecting field as a whole were too narrowly focused on court rugs woven in artisan workshops, and that not enough attention was being given to nomadic and village rugs. McCoy's goals for the International Haji Baba Club, while its first members were American, was to establish a global network of rug and carpet enthusiasts, collectors, scholars, and experts. For this effort, he traveled across Europe and Asia in search of excellent examples of village and domestic rugs throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Many of the people that he met on his travels, European collectors and curators, later became members of the International Haji Baba Society themselves. He also built connections and spread his ideas about evolving the idea of rug and carpet collecting to include village weavings with other important collectors and scholars like Charles Grant Ellis and Joe McMullen. Despite being well known amongst his peers, as the collector to know if you were serious about starting your own collection or getting involved with museum collections in the 1960s, he and Caroline were very private people, and much of what I've been able to learn about them and their mindsets has come from their own collection and from the people around them. Most of McCoy's rug and carpet collection consists of 19th and very early 20th century works from different tribes across Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Iran. Mirrored by his ethos for the establishment of the Washington Haji Babas, McCoy was primarily interested in domestic and village rugs. He also primarily stuck to antiques, as defined by the IRS as being 100 years old because of the quality of the materials, especially the use of natural dye, prior to the invention and widespread use of synthetic dyes. McCoy actively steered clear of collecting modern rugs because of their increased use of the synthetic dye stuffs, which were susceptible to running and which often age more harshly than natural dyes. His love for village rugs was primarily aesthetic. He was drawn to the colors and the geometry, but also to the stories that he and many other contemporary collectors saw in these objects. Since McCoy had been collecting for 6 decades, his collection was, and still is, one of the most diverse of its kind. While his collecting habits did mirror changing tastes and broaden the more he saw, and later reflected Caroline's tastes once they started buying together, McCoy's own tastes remained central to how he collected. While he didn't think about value and saw collecting, while he did occasionally think about value and did see collecting as a business opportunity, he collected primarily because of his passion and love for the material. The McCoy Jones Collection as a whole therefore offers genuine insight into McCoy and Caroline as people and impassioned connoisseurs. To those that knew them, Caroline and McCoy were a loving couple who put all of their energy into their rug collection. Without children, they focused their time and attention on the collection and its preservation. The couple lived with their rug and carpet collection in the various homes that they shared in England, Washington, D.C., and Reno throughout their marriage. Koenig described the, quote, discreet elegance of their home in D.C. and the, quote, decent George III and Regency furniture, good silver and china, and portraits done by Rayburn and other well-known painters around 1800. And of course, there were some glorious carpets on the floor, end quote. McCoy described living with his collection in Reno too, and stated that he and Caroline would walk on their rugs, saying that, quote, "that's what they're made for, to be walked on." McCoy and Caroline would rotate the rugs that they had out on the floor of all of their homes to manage wear and tear and fading. The rest would live in their storage cabinets in the ruggery that they maintained in each home that they moved into, and it may take 5 years before they saw a rug again before it was rotated out. McCoy and Caroline stayed away from auction houses and primarily purchased carpets and rugs from dealers. They also traveled around Central Asia and the Middle East to find the best examples and to have what they perceived to be the most authentic experience of in connection with these textiles. Caroline and McCoy even traveled to areas not typically visited by Western tourists, like the Afghan border along the mountains of Iran. When a jeep was no longer able to cross the terrain, they would travel by donkey and mule and sleep in tents on the ground. Koenig said that while McCoy's, quote, book knowledge of the rug weaving tribes in the areas that he and Caroline visited, he developed a feel of the place, end quote, by doing this, and that from these experiences knew how Turkmen people lived and worked in their environments. It was common in many rug collecting circles in the middle of the century to think that this sort of observational knowledge, even if it did not come from tribe members or weavers themselves, was more authentic type of knowledge. In 1984, after McCoy was no longer able to travel, Caroline took over acquiring works for their collection, and since she had slightly different personal tastes than McCoy, the collection was further expanded to include embroidered Suzanis from Uzbekistan and a world-class collection of Anatolian kilams that Caroline purchased with the museum's collection in mind, and which remains one of the largest collections of its kind outside of Turkey. While McCoy grew into a knowledgeable and rug scholar and respected the more traditionally academic-minded side of rug scholarship that was developing, he said of learning about rugs as a collector, quote, "What is important is the artistic creativity, the liveliness of the colors, the handle of the wool, and the harmony of the design, which must be representative of the tribe which made it," end quote. He was also well respected by curators and other museum professionals because of his dedication to the preservation of his collection and to using it as a way to educate and pull people together. Those in the museum world also courted him for his ability to bolster interest in and community around carpets and textiles from Central Asia and the Middle East. McCoy wrote several books and pamphlets about rugs and the weaving traditions of different Turkmen tribes, as noticed and understood through his experiences as a collector and connoisseur. Many important United States rug and carpet collections are built from private collections amassed by passionate collectors who did not necessarily have formal training, but had an immense amount of input from merchants and tribe members who wove the rugs or prepared the raw material for weaving. In recent decades, there has been a cultural push to study and catalog these collections using sources from historians and academics and collectors, as well as artists and weavers. In the 19th century, collecting art objects, for which there was only aesthetic value and no readily understandable utilitarian value, was largely confined to the upper classes. And while, quote, Islamic art, and I think that this is really too broad a descriptor for how a lot of collections really started cataloging their work, were collected in Europe for centuries by nobles and landowners, collections of Islamic art were not really organized for public view in museums or art institutions in the West until the mid-19th century. In the United States, this happened a little later, not until the late 19th century and early 20th century. At this point, the collecting of, quote, art objects was still mostly done by the wealthy, but was expanding to other social classes, and collecting Islamic art was at times viewed in a different light because of patriarchal perceptions of non-Western art. During the latter part of the 19th century, Americans traveled more to the Middle East. Many artists, especially those affiliated with aestheticism, a late 19th century philosophical and artistic movement that placed higher value on appearance or aesthetics over function, were inspired by views of the, quote, Orient, and wanted items to adorn their studios, and fill their painted scenes. 4 international expositions in the United States between 1876 and 1926 also drove interest in the Middle East and other areas of Asia. These world fairs in Philadelphia in 1876, Chicago in 1893, St. Louis in 1904, and again in Philadelphia in 1926, all featured specific presentations meant to highlight the Middle East and essentially encouraged tourism en place, as explained by Marilyn Jenkins Medina, an art historian and curator emeritus of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Islamic Art Department. In an article, Collecting the Orient at the Met, Early Tastemakers in America from 2000s, Jenkins Medina also says, quote, despite the obvious pitfalls of attempting to depict entire cultures in what can only be seen as a series of elaborate period rooms, often animated with actors indigenous to the communities represented, these expositions greatly stimulated the growing interest in the Orient, for they offered quick and seemingly realistic impressions of the societies and cultures they purported to represent, end quote. The academic field of Islamic studies in the United States developed with the formation of collections of Islamic art in art museums, mostly on the East Coast, like the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, among many others. Many of the early and now foundational collections of what was later called Islamic art in US museums came from a handful of collectors, some with cultural ties to specific regions, and some who were just passionate connoisseurs. The first academic posting in the study of Islamic art was at the University of Michigan and was created in 1933. In her article, Through the Renaissance Frame, Carpets and the Beginning of Islamic Art in 19th Century Vienna and Berlin, art historian Denise Marie Thies specifically looks at the role of collecting within the larger picture of the development of the study of Islamic arts in Europe. She argues that there has been a scholarly emphasis on the idea that there was a, quote, strong desire in the late 19th century Europe and the United States for paintings in architectural spaces that evoked the fantasy of an imaginary Orient, end quote, and notes that carpets had long been an area of collecting by European nobles, with the importation of knotted carpets from the Islamic world starting as early as the 14th century. She also notes that early in carpet displays in Europe, there was a tendency to focus on exhibition rugs that were depicted in Renaissance paintings, and later paintings that included nobles and aristocrats. Thies also stipulates that the role of carpets, because they were viewed for a long time as applied art or as props, has long been overlooked in the study and the development of the field of Islamic arts. A series of 4 rug exhibits, starting with one in Vienna in 1891, Stuttgart in 1909, New York in 1910, and Budapest in 1914, also introduced European and American audiences not just to rugs, but to their display as art and design objects that further evoked the feeling of the exotic and reflected how European nobles had used imported rugs as symbols of power for centuries. As public art collecting institutions developed, carpets started to be collected not necessarily as art objects, but as objects for design research. The South Kensington Museum in London, now the Victoria and Albert South Kensington, started seeking out carpets from Persia, across the Middle East, Anatolia, and across Central Asia in the mid-19th century. They started building this collection while the fad for carpets from the East was popular amongst collectors and artists, but also to be used partially as reference for industrial designers and those working in the applied arts. Since many early collections were built by individuals who were buying for reference purposes and were organized using the amassed collections of private collectors, many Western museums' collections and their early histories reflect those donors and their mindsets and their tastes. Art historians Sheila Blair and Jonathan Bloom also note that for much of history, the Western viewpoint of Islamic visual and aesthetic culture was rooted in colonial endeavors, and that the expansion of the field of Islamic studies was further developed after regional dynasties like the Ottoman and Mughal empires started to weaken in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Regions along the Silk Road were carved up by imperial powers like the British and Russian empires. And these different powers took ownership over land and physical objects, but also tried to make the artistic and handicraft traditions of the people living in these Muslim areas fit into their own existing ideas about art and how it should be displayed. While there was already interest in Islamic art in the United States, forced migration in Europe at the time, which at the time was the epicenter of Islamic studies in the West in the 1920s and 30s, brought many European scholars to the United States. With them, these scholars brought their expertise and their desire to establish new Islamic art collections and research positions. After World War II, the United States emerged as a leader in the scholarship of Islamic art in the Western world. As the 20th century progressed, American interest in Central Asia and the Middle East continued to increase during the Cold War and the oil crisis in the 1970s. As oil-producing areas became wealthier and diplomacy shifted, more and more research and fellowship opportunities for American researchers and graduate students became available across Asia with the support of the State Department. In 1973, the San Francisco Chronicle reported on the rise in popularity of antique and naturally dyed rugs for interior use in people's homes. The reporters interviewed a salesperson in Macy's rug department that the Chronicle referred to as the Macy's rug expert, as well as a lecturer and harpsichordist, who said that there was, quote, a diminishing supply of San Francisco's finest old rugs. The city is the Oriental Rug Center for the Western United States and is known the world over for fine old rugs. Most of them were originally brought here from the East at the turn of the century in attempts to civilize the gold rush boomtown. But many of them are gone now, sold to European collectors and dealers, end quote. The reporters went on to say that this rug salesperson's, quote, dreams of a local museum collection, but shudders, it's probably too late, end quote. While I can't say that this is necessarily correct, that they were brought here for the gold rush and sold to European dealers after, I do think that this speaks to the growing excitement around rugs from across Central Asia and the Middle East in the 1970s in San Francisco and the surrounding Bay Area. Interestingly, and I think that this relates to some of the concepts that we've discussed earlier, much of the excitement around rugs here come from two perspectives: interior decorating and interest in the East as a concept that I think is related to the counterculture. So this leads into why the McCoy Jones Collection was brought here to San Francisco, to a place where neither McCoy nor Caroline lived nor had a connection. During an advanced look of preview, H. McCoy Jones Collection of tribal rugs, which ran from December 1980 through January 1981 at the Old de Young, McCoy saw his rugs on the wall for the first time. McCoy and Caroline decided to bequeath their collection to the museum in the 1970s, and it was announced in 1980 to much fanfare in many Bay Area newspapers. The preview exhibition in 1980 was designed to drum up excitement for the collection. A booklet with text written by Ian McKibben White, director of the Fine Arts Museums at the time, and D. Graham Keith, curator emeritus of decorative arts, reads, quote, the initial presentation of over 60 rugs is only a preview of this remarkable windfall. It has been mounted on short notice to celebrate the presentation of the collection rather than wait 2 years to fit it into a more accommodating slot in the museum's exhibition schedule, end quote. The booklet from the preview exhibition in 1980 continued by saying, quote, no catalog is available yet, but what will come in time after proper research has been completed. A series of exhibitions arranged by tribal groupings will be developed, and most probably a large comprehensive exhibition can be mounted to circulate in this country, perhaps with international stops, end quote. According to a press release from 1980 announcing the McCoy Jones Collection bequest to the Fine Arts Museums, quote, one of the most important facets of the H. McCoy Jones Collection is its value as a visual record of a heritage that is fast disappearing. Many of the types of rugs in the collection have not been produced in the last 50 to 100 years. Rugs woven since do not match the beauty of the antique examples because the wool and dyes used more recently are vastly inferior to the wool from sheep of nomadic tribes and the natural dyes used by the nomads. Also, the designs are no longer executed in the traditional manner by weavers whose skill and design vocabulary were passed from mother to daughter, end quote. As a result of the McCoy Jones Collection, the museums became one of the most important repositories of Central Asian and Islamic nomadic textiles in the world. It is a unique collection because it has so many high-quality 19th century examples of rugs, carpets, and weavings meant specifically to be used in domestic settings. Ian McKibben White, director of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco from 1970 until his retirement in 1987, who also oversaw the merge of the M.H. DeYoung Memorial Museum and the California Palace of the Legion of Honor to become one institution, was interviewed by the Oral History Center at UC Berkeley's Bancroft Library in 2021. McKibben White discussed the McCoy Jones gift and its significance to the museums. He felt very strongly about the collection and was a key figure in bringing it to San Francisco. Phyllis Wattis, a trustee at the time who also left a major artist acquisitions fund for the museums, informed White about McCoy and his collection. Wattis had remembered McCoy maybe living or working somewhere around Napa, but by the 1970s, he was already back in Bethesda, Maryland, with Caroline and had become a well-known village rug collector on the East Coast. McKibben White said that by the time he met McCoy, he was a very successful and very wealthy investor. White goes on to say that other museums on the East Coast had been courting McCoy and trying to get his collection, but he did not like how some other museums had invested or how they did business, so he was very open to other offers. Over time, as McKibben White cultivated McCoy and Caroline as donors to the museums, his relationship with them also became personal, and he would go visit them in Bethesda and eventually in Reno once they moved there. White spoke of how he noticed interest in rugs in the Bay Area grew after it was announced that the McCoy Jones Collection would be coming to the museums. McCoy and Caroline also spoke about wanting to cultivate San Francisco as a center for the study of rugs and tribal textiles, as being one of the reasons that they chose to donate their collections here. They also thought that it would have a greater impact here than on the East Coast because so many other major art museums along the East Coast already had impressive and well-known rug collections. According to Walter Blum, a writer at California Living magazine, who published an article on the collection in 1981, McCoy offered his collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C., and that both turned him down. He was happy with his collection going to San Francisco after, quote, 4 years, a lot of talking, luck, and tenacity, as he said, McKibben White put it, and because they, Eastern museums, don't serve a purpose. While the McCoy Joneses could have given their collection to other institutions, it was thought that the collection would have a greater impact on the fine arts museums and on San Francisco as a city. In addition to helping to popularize rugs and their study in the Bay Area, McCoy was excited at the prospect of having his collection on view, which he thought would be maybe more likely in San Francisco than on the East Coast institutions because, quote, stuff is locked up back there for years, and that the only reason to collect anything is to educate and let people, quote, see nice things. Other articles announcing the gift and the preview exhibition similarly pitted San Francisco and its textile art scenes against the East Coast. Another 1981 article written by Alan Temko, a fixture in the San Francisco Chronicle's date book at the time, said that McCoy, quote, appeared out of the blue, end quote, to give his collection to the fine arts museums. Temko described the collection as, quote, gutsy, direct, totally sincere, end quote. He went on to say, it is to Jones' credit that he was one of the earliest collectors who deliberately chose tribal rugs for their intrinsic worth. They are still snubbed by a few great museums, such as the Metropolitan, which show only rare court masterpieces, as perhaps they should. But there's no reason why the Textile Museum in Washington, which with the Philadelphia Museum of Art joins the Met in a triad of great rug collections, should have been so snooty when approached by Jones, end quote. In a letter to McKibben White that same year, McCoy very politely, along with his excitement over the news coverage of his donation, expressed his frustration with many of these articles and called out several misquotes, inaccuracies, and ill-considered phrases. He was, quote, highly incensed by both Temko and Blum's articles and their assertions that several East Coast museums had turned him down, saying that he did not know where the writers had gotten that from and that it was not factual. He also was offended by a misquote in Blum's article and that saying, quote, most of the Eastern museums are lousy anyway, end quote, is not something that he would have even thought and definitely would have not have said if he even believed it. He went on to say that he felt it quite very unfair to the museum, and more particularly to the collections as well as to the donor, end quote, to say anything like that. McKibben White was also frustrated by the press's insistence that San Francisco was a last choice for the collection, and even wrote in a letter to the editor about Blum's article, quote, "Congratulations to Walter Blum for his lively account of the fabulous bestowal of H. McCoy Jones to San Francisco. He has captured not only the perspicacity of a generous collector, but also the value of this magnificent collection as a resource to San Francisco for the future. I would suggest one correction. The Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco were Jones's first choice as the repository for his collection. Though he had associations with other museums over the years, none ever had the opportunity to turn him down," end quote. While San Francisco may not have been the most obvious choice geographically for McCoy and Caroline to donate their collection, it was definitely not out of the blue. The museum's relationship, as well as McKibben White's relationship with McCoy and Caroline, was carefully orchestrated and organized. McKibben White wanted the collection for the Fine Arts Museums, and he believed in its significance. He sought out the collection, and the museums actively pursued McCoy and Caroline as donors to convince them that San Francisco was the right home for their collection. While McKibben White, as the museum's director, courted McCoy and Caroline, another very important figure in the development and further research of the collection, once it got to the museums, was Kathy Kuttner, a specialist in non-Western textiles who started at the museums in 1982 after being asked to steward the McCoy Jones Collection, along with other rugs, by founding curator of the Textiles Department, Anna Gray Bennett. After McCoy died in 1987, Caroline continued to collect textiles and costumes from around the globe. While she continued to collect Central Asian work, she also expanded the collection to include works from across East Asia, Africa, and the Americas. She had a particular fondness for headwear and became a first-rate collector in her own right, purchasing a collection of around 200 Anatolian kilims from another private collector, Gary Muse. However, was what really set Caroline apart as a shrewd collector in her own right. The McCoy Jones Kilim collection was donated to the museum over the course of several years from 1987 to 2004 and became a world-renowned collection, the largest collection of Anatolian flat-woven kilims outside of Turkey. In addition to the initial bequest and to its kilims, Caroline donated another 400 or so costume and textiles after McCoy's death. While McKibben White cultivated the museum's relationship with McCoy and Caroline and helped convince them to donate their collection to San Francisco, it was under Harry Parker's tenure as director of the Fine Arts Museums from 1987 to 2005 that the collection was formally accessioned in the museum's holdings. Parker followed through with the gift, but according to McKibben White, also became personally taken with the rugs. His wife, Ellen Parker, even served as a volunteer in the Textile Conservation Lab to help clean the rugs, which finally came to the museums in 1988. After the first preview exhibition of the McCoy Jones collection in 1980, there was a second loan exhibition of McCoy and Caroline's collection in 1982, entitled Tent in Town, Rugs and Embroideries from Central Asia, for which an informational packet was also produced. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, there were several other exhibits at the DeYoung that displayed highlights of the McCoy Jones collection in different ways. In addition to multiple shows of the collection and a permanent gallery space at the old DeYoung building that continuously rotated works from the McCoy Jones collection, there was a dedicated curator of the museum's rug collection for several years. One of the most famous exhibitions that came out of the McCoy Jones collection was the 1990 to 1991 show, The Anatolian Kilim and Ancient Art. Several textile exhibitions, including one called the Turkmen Storage Bag that took place from 2019 to 2021, also pulled extensively from the McCoy Jones collection. In his interview with the Bancroft Oral History Center, McKibben White discussed a prejudice that he had noticed during his time at the museums against non-Western work, especially village and domestic works, or quote-unquote tribal art, which McCoy Jones collection mostly represented. Much of the Islamic textiles and carpets that had gone to other institutions were, as I said before, court pieces made specifically for sultans or nobles by workshop system trained artisans using the most expensive materials available. McKibben White and Parker still believed in the power of the McCoy Jones collection precisely because of its unique emphasis on domestic textiles that uplifted everyday weavers and beauty. Both truly believed in its importance in establishing the legacy of the Fine Arts Museums as a premier textile collecting institution. In addition to the collection, the McCoy Joneses supported the Textile Arts Department with a significant donation, and those endowment funds are still used to care for the rug collection, to review, research, and showcase it today. Diane Mott, former textile curator from 1990 to 2009, created an annual lecture series in which researchers present on topics related to carpets and other textiles from Central Asia, or in this case, the history of the McCoy Jones collection itself. Since 1988, there have been several reviews done of different parts of the McCoy Jones collections in 1998, 2003, 2006, and 2005, or in 2025, by various scholars in the field of carpet studies to assess the collection and offer additional research and information. Carbon dating and dye analysis was also conducted for individual masterpieces within the larger collection. The McCoy Jones collection has consistently been an area of interest for scholars and students, and the Textiles Department continues to collaborate with outside researchers and PhD students to offer research support. In June 2021, a project to rephotograph the 630-ish objects of the original bequest was started and eventually completed in the summer of 2024. These new high-resolution images are available on the museum's collection website, and as we continue to catalog and research each item, we're able to slowly but surely get that information onto our website as well. Today, highlights of the McCoy Jones collection are currently on view upstairs at the de Young as part of the exhibition, the McCoy Jones Collection, Textiles from Central Asia and the Middle East. The exhibition uses work from McCoy's original bequest of domestic rugs and textiles and uses his collection as a framework for its display. Opening with the first rug that he collected in 1922 and moving through works from his Turkmen and more broadly Central Asian and Middle Eastern collection, the exhibition concludes with a new acquisition to the museums by Azerbaijani multidisciplinary artist Faig Ahmed. Using funds by exchange from the McCoy Jones collection, Doubts 2020 was purchased in 2024 as a way to create a dialogue with contemporary work and continue the legacy of the McCoy Jones collection. The McCoy Jones collection continues to be a bedrock of the Costume and Textiles Department's holdings and the subject of new research by scholars domestically and internationally. Its legacy here at the museums, in San Francisco, and amongst scholars and enthusiasts also attests to the foresight that McCoy, Caroline, and the staff that was here when the gift was brought in had in making the Bay Area a hub of textile research. I would love to take any questions if there is time, and I hope that you will all go up and see the McCoy Jones Collection, Textiles from Central Asia and the Middle East, if you have not already. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Do we know the value of the rug collection?
So that's not something that I can disclose to the public. I will say that there's multiple articles that came out in the 1980s that talk about a quote-unquote $1 million collection. So do with that what you will.
Is it feasible to get a copy of this talk somewhere?
There's a recording that will be available on, I think, our YouTube channel, probably in the next few days.
Thank you.
I was curious by the term domestic use. Can you clarify? The question probably is more, do we know what the original use of these rugs were?
So by domestic, I mean pieces used in homes. So the same way that people live with rugs in their homes, that's how I'm using the term domestic. Some objects may have been used just as rugs on the floor. Some of them may have been used as bed coverings or covers for the walls to help insulate the walls of a tent, as bath mats, as blankets, but used by regular people living their regular lives.
I learned a lot. Thank you so much. I have a question about that Suzani that you showed. It said circa 1800.
Yes.
And I was wondering if carbon dating had been done. It seems like a really early date, so I was just curious.
I'm not sure if carbon dating has specifically been done on this object. I have to go back and check some of our records. But it is an early date. We have some very early examples in the collection, but I can go back and see in our records and see if there was carbon dating done.
It never occurred to me, but have makers ever been identified of particularly the rugs? I think Suzani, there'd be multiple people working on them, but because they were buying so directly, although you did say it was dealers, but has any research been done on to identify particular makers of the rugs?
It's a really good question. So no, for the most part, with a lot of these types of materials, we don't have maker records. It's common in most, I'll use the word domestic again, but in most textile arts throughout history, pieces that were used in sort of practical or domestic settings, it's common to not have any sort of maker information. There's been a lot of research done in the last few decades, especially from sort of a gendered theory lens, sort of thinking that because a lot of these objects were made by women, and the rugs on display here, the Suzanis, were all made by women, that there was this idea that their, home labor was not necessarily worth having their name on. It would be very, very difficult to go back and figure out who was making these specific objects historically, because everyone in a community would have been weaving in some capacity, or someone in their family would have been weaving in some capacity, so it's pretty impossible. I'll say now that a lot of contemporary rug makers, contemporary weavers, do really see their work as artwork, so they do sign it. It has their name, even if they're not physically signing it. It has their name associated with it in some way.
Fantastic presentation. I thought the talk was fantastic, and you can see that you've done such in-depth research and you have such a joy for the material. I'm curious if there are any tidbits or fun facts that maybe didn't make your formal presentation that you might think about sharing with the audience.
A lot. So I think when I started in this role in 2024, there was this ongoing project to rephotograph parts of this collection. And it had been sort of slow going. And when I took it on, I was very eager to be done with it and to have everything photographed and to get those photographs onto our website, which is a great resource for those that can't come to the museum in person. And I think what was really exciting was it was a surprise every day, kind of what was going to get rolled out on the photography studio and sort of seeing something new every day. Something that I think is maybe a little sort of less fun, definitely less fun for our conservation department, is that we're really aware of their dogs. I think a lot of the time when we unroll pieces and we bring them into the lab, so that's a little bit less fun.
Are there any plans to exhibit the Kilim collection again? The town and
Tent in town.
was a wonderful exhibit.
There's no immediate plans to show the Kilim collection. As most museums in the United States, we work on a schedule way out in advance, and we have to sort of Tetris our exhibitions together. Textiles are really hard to exhibit. They can only be on view for around 6 months at a time. But we're still researching this collection. We still have people that come and visit it and do study center appointments with us at our study center here and write about it. But there's no plans to immediately show any of these.
I really enjoyed the exhibit that you have upstairs now. Can you say something about all the other hundreds of carpets that are part of the exhibit and maybe why are these representative of those, or are they different?
Yes, so these are generally representative of the breadth of the original bequest from McCoy Jones. So there's 16 carpets on view upstairs. It's a very broad collection in terms of geographic landscape. These are highlights, so these are really great quality examples of what they are. We have, for the most part, a pretty large collection for each individual geographic location and for each tribe. So these are really just sort of highlights from the breadth of that collection.
I'd like to ask a question about the Haji Baba Club.
Yes.
My wife and I had a chance to actually attend a session of the club, and my impression was that there were, besides collectors, there were quite a few dealers in the club. First of all, let me compliment you on trying to do some historical analysis of the origins of the club. And I had a specific question about the photograph you showed. Why are those men wearing shorts?
So I think doing research into the Haji Babas was probably one of my favorite parts of this whole project. Generally, I find, that sort of culture of people really, really interested in something just sort of fascinating. They're wearing shorts because they want to. There's also someone wearing a kilt in this photo. There's another photo which I did not include in this presentation that shows a whole bunch of Hajis sitting shirtless. So it was really, in addition to being, an academic club, it was also a social club. Yeah. But the one in shorts is McCoy. Yes.
Last question.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Have any of the tribes been identified, and are those tribes still weaving?
Yes. All of the tribes are identified in our catalog online. They're on the labels as well upstairs in the gallery. Yeah, they are still weaving. So all of these cultures are still existent and still alive today, maybe not in the same way that they were historically. Not as much, there's not as much weaving happening, but it does still happen as sort of a historical and cultural area of importance. Thank you.